There are stories that live quietly beneath the surface of fame, hidden behind rehearsed smiles and polished performances. For decades, Marie Osmond was one of America's most beloved entertainers, a woman who seemed to carry the weight of a perfect life with effortless grace. But beneath that image was a truth so painful, so carefully guarded, that even the people who loved her most had no idea it existed. The moment she finally chose to speak, to name the darkness she had carried since childhood, it did not just change how the world saw her. It changed everything she understood about herself. To understand why Marie's revelation landed with such force, you have to understand what she was protecting for so long, and what it cost her. Marie Osmond was born into a world where image was everything. As the only daughter among 9 children in one of entertainment's most recognized families, she grew up in a household where discipline, performance, and public presentation were treated as sacred obligations. The Osmond family machine ran on hard work, religious devotion, and the appearance of unity, and every child understood their role within it. By the time Marie was a teenager, she was already sharing stages with legends, appearing on national television, and carrying the expectations of an entire family's reputation on her shoulders. To the outside world it looked like a charmed life. But inside that world, something had already gone deeply wrong. The abuse began when Marie was very young. It did not happen in a dark alley or at the hands of a stranger. It happened in places her parents trusted, around people they believed were safe. That detail, perhaps more than any other, is what made the trauma so difficult to process and even harder to disclose. When the danger hides itself inside the familiar, inside the trusted, inside the everyday routine of a child's life, the child often has no language for what is happening to them. They only know that something is wrong, and that speaking about it feels impossible. Marie was warned to stay silent. She was told, with the kind of cruelty that only someone willing to harm a child could summon, that speaking out would destroy everything her family had worked for. A little girl who had already been taught that the family's reputation was her responsibility absorbed that threat completely. And so she said nothing. What followed was decades of carrying an invisible wound through one of the most visible lives in American entertainment. Marie continued performing, recording, smiling, and showing up, because that was what was expected. But the trauma she buried never stayed buried completely. She later described developing a deep and confusing fear of men following the abuse. That fear shaped her relationships, her sense of self, and her understanding of her own identity in ways she struggled to make sense of for years. As a young girl, she found herself questioning everything, including who she was, what she felt, and whether the confusion she experienced meant something fundamental about her nature. It was only much later, with the perspective that time and healing can sometimes offer, that she came to understand those feelings had been rooted in trauma, not identity. Her mind had been responding to what had been done to her, not revealing who she truly was. What makes Marie's story particularly significant is how ordinary the silence was. She was not unusual in keeping the secret. She was, in many ways, a product of a generation and a culture in which these subjects simply were not discussed. Shame protected abusers. Fear protected abusers. The fear of causing more pain to the people you love protected abusers. Marie experienced all of it. She tried to move forward. She built a career, built a family, achieved more professional success than most people could imagine. But trauma has a way of following a person no matter how far they run, no matter how brightly they perform, no matter how convincingly they smile for the cameras. The wound was always there. There was no single dramatic moment when everything changed. Healing rarely works that way. But becoming a mother herself marked a significant turning point in Marie's relationship with her own past. Holding her own children, being responsible for their safety and emotional well-being, brought everything she had buried back to the surface with a force she could no longer ignore. Mothers who have survived childhood abuse often describe this experience. The way parenthood cracks open old wounds not out of cruelty but out of necessity. Because you cannot fully protect a child from dangers you refuse to name. Anne-Marie Osmond had spent a lifetime refusing to name them. For the first time she began speaking. Not publicly at first, not to the world, but internally and eventually to those she trusted. The process of finding words for what had happened to her, of organizing those memories into something she could actually articulate, was its own form of painful labor. But it was also the beginning of something she had not been able to reach before, the possibility of genuine healing. When she eventually described her experiences publicly, she was careful and deliberate. She confirmed that the abuse was sexual in nature. She confirmed that it had occurred during her childhood. She confirmed that the person responsible was not a family member but someone who had access to her through the trusted circles surrounding her family. and she confirmed that she had been threatened into silence, made to believe that telling the truth would bring devastation down on everyone she loved. For years, discussions about Marie Osmond's childhood trauma circulated in general terms. She had alluded to mistreatment. She had referenced the lasting effects. But there is a profound difference between hinting at darkness and stepping fully into the light to face it by name. When Marie finally named the person responsible, describing specifically what had happened and who had done it, the impact of that disclosure extended far beyond her own story. Because one of the most persistent myths surrounding childhood sexual abuse is that silence somehow protects the survivor. That keeping the secret is an act of grace. That speaking is more damaging than staying quiet. Marie's willingness to move beyond vague references and name her experience with specificity dismantled that myth in real time. Naming is not simply about assigning blame, though accountability matters enormously. Naming is about reclaiming the narrative that abuse strips from its victims. It is about refusing to continue carrying the abuser's secret on their behalf. It is about saying, clearly and without apology, "This happened, it was wrong, and I will no longer organize my life around protecting the person who hurt me." For the millions of people watching and listening, many of whom carry their own buried stories, that act of naming carries tremendous weight. Research on trauma disclosure consistently shows that being witnessed, being believed, and hearing others name similar experiences are among the most powerful factors in a survivor's healing journey. Marie's speaking was not just about her own liberation. It was about every person who heard her and felt, perhaps for the first time, that their own silence might one day be breakable too. Understanding what Marie's disclosure meant requires understanding what the silence cost her over the years. The eating disorder she developed as a teenager was not simply the result of cruel producers or impossible industry standards, though those pressures were real and devastating in their own right. Trauma and disordered eating are deeply connected in ways that researchers continue to study. Survivors of childhood sexual abuse experience significantly elevated rates of eating disorders, self-esteem destruction, and body image distortion. The body becomes a complicated territory, something to punish, control, diminish, or disappear, when it has been violated. Marie spent years working through the psychological aftermath of her abuse in ways that were never publicly identified as being connected to it. The perfectionism, the relentless drive to perform, the difficulty accepting love, the complicated relationships, the postpartum depression that broke through even her most resilient defenses, all of these carried the fingerprints of early trauma. This is not speculation or armchair psychology. It is the documented reality of what untreated childhood sexual abuse does to people over decades of living. She eventually sought help, engaged with therapy, and began the slow, nonlinear work of healing. But the most significant shift, the one that made everything else possible, was the decision to stop protecting her abuser with her silence. Perhaps one of the most heartbreaking dimensions of Marie's story is how completely she protected those around her from knowing what she had experienced. Her brothers, the same siblings she performed alongside, traveled with, and spent her entire childhood beside, had no idea. The people who knew her best were kept entirely in the dark. This is not unusual among survivors. The impulse to protect family members from pain, to avoid becoming a burden, to maintain the appearance of normality, these are powerful forces that often operate even when they are working against the survivor's own well-being. Marie had been raised in a household that valued presentation. She had been threatened into believing that speaking would cause harm. The combination of those two forces kept her secret sealed for decades even from the people who loved her. When she finally began sharing the truth, the response from her family was part of what helped her continue moving forward. Being believed matters enormously. Being surrounded by people who respond to disclosure with love rather than denial or deflection is not something every survivor gets to experience, which makes it all the more significant when it happens. Marie Osmond has never presented herself as a perfect model of recovered wholeness. She has spoken honestly about the way trauma does not fully disappear even after decades of healing work. Old patterns resurface. Certain situations trigger old responses. The emotional architecture that abuse builds inside a person does not simply dissolve because they have chosen to face it. It requires sustained, patient, often painful dismantling, piece by piece, memory by memory, year by year. But she has also spoken about what reclamation feels like. About reaching the place where she could look back at the child she had been, the frightened little girl carrying secrets that were never hers to carry, with something approaching compassion rather than shame. That shift, from shame to compassion, is one of the defining markers of genuine healing for survivors of childhood trauma. It does not happen quickly. It does not happen easily. But it happens. Her faith played a significant role in that journey. For Marie, spirituality was never a simple comfort or a convenient belief system. It was a framework through which she processed the most painful experiences of her life, including the abuse. She has spoken about arriving at a kind of peace, not forgiveness in the sense of minimizing what happened, but release in the sense of refusing to let the damage define the entirety of who she is. Marie Osmond is not the first famous survivor of childhood sexual abuse to speak publicly, and she will not be the last. But her story carries particular resonance for several reasons that extend beyond celebrity disclosure. She represents a generation of survivors who were taught, with tremendous force, to stay silent. A generation for whom shame was a more familiar response to abuse than outrage. A generation in which institutions, including religious ones, professional ones, and family ones, routinely prioritized their own reputations over the safety and truth-telling of children. Her willingness to speak challenges the idea that survival means burying the past as deep as possible and simply enduring. It offers a different possibility, that looking directly at what happened, naming it clearly and refusing to keep the abuser's secret,